Vikings are famous for crossing the Atlantic in wooden boats. Cool, ancient Filipinos were catching sharks in the open ocean 35,000 years before Vikings even existed. And no, that's not a typo. Vikings are legendary. Their longships terrorized Europe for centuries. But there's another seafaring civilization that makes Viking navigation look like a weekend hobby. And almost nobody knows about them. Ancient Filipinos were building ocean-going vessels when Vikings were still figuring out how to cross rivers. I'm not exaggerating. The archaeological evidence is so overwhelming that it's actually embarrassing this isn't taught in schools. By the end of this video, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about ancient maritime history. Our goal on this video is to get 500 likes. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell, turn on notifications. Join us as we uncover more hidden story. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know. Vikings dominated the seas from roughly 800 to 1100 CE. Their longships could sail up rivers, cross oceans, and beach anywhere. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They founded kingdoms from Russia to Sicily. In terms of pure historical impact, Vikings absolutely changed the world. The longship itself was an engineering masterpiece. Clinker-built hulls with overlapping planks made them flexible enough to handle rough seas. They were shallow drafted, meaning they could navigate in just 3 feet of water. A single longship could carry 60 warriors plus cargo. They had both sails and oars, so they weren't dependent on wind. And that famous dragonhead on the prow, that wasn't just decoration, it was psychological warfare. Viking shipbuilding technology allowed them to expand their world in ways that seemed impossible. They sailed from Scandinavia to Constantinople. They traded in Baghdad. They established settlements in Iceland and Greenland. The Viking Age represents one of the most impressive maritime achievements in medieval European history. Now here's where things get interesting. While Vikings were perfecting their longships in the 800 CE, Filipinos had already been masters of open ocean navigation for tens of thousands of years. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands. In 2025, researchers published findings that completely rewrite what we thought we knew about ancient maritime technology. They discovered that prehistoric Filipinos were creating sophisticated plant-based rope and cordage technology at least 40,000 years ago. This isn't speculation. This is hard archaeological evidence from multiple sites across the Philippine archipelago. Why does rope matter? Because you can't build an ocean-worthy vessel without it. You need cordage for lashing hulls together, rigging sails, creating fishing nets, and securing cargo. The Vikings had rope, obviously, but they had metal tools, iron nails, and 2,000 years of Mediterranean shipbuilding knowledge to build on. Ancient Filipinos were doing this in the Stone Age. Think about what that means. 40,000 years ago, there were no metal tools, no written instructions, no trade networks to share technology. And yet, Filipinos were creating rope strong enough to build boats that could survive 100-kilometer ocean crossings. Because that's exactly what they did. If this is blowing your mind right now, you need to hit subscribe because we're building the largest community on YouTube dedicated to history they never taught you. We're uncovering stories like this every single week. Ancient civilizations that were erased from textbooks, technologies that shouldn't exist, cultures that changed the world but never got credit. Over 1,000 of you are already here digging through real history with us. Drop a comment with which ancient civilization we should investigate next, because your suggestions literally shape what we research. The Philippine Islands aren't connected by land bridges. They never were, even during ice ages when sea levels dropped. To get from island to island, you had to cross open ocean. And archaeological evidence proves humans were living on multiple Philippine islands over 40,000 years ago. They didn't swim there. They built boats. But it gets even more impressive. New evidence shows that ancient Filipinos weren't just paddling between islands. They were deep-sea fishing. 35,000 years ago, they were catching tuna and sharks in open ocean. Do you understand how insane that is? Deep-sea fishing requires boats stable enough to handle ocean swells, strong enough to haul in fish that weigh hundreds of pounds, and reliable enough that you're confident you'll make it back to shore. Europeans weren't doing this. They were hunting reindeer and painting caves, which is impressive in its own way, but they weren't building boats to catch sharks in the open ocean. That level of maritime technology simply didn't exist in Europe for another 30,000 years. Let's talk about the boats themselves. Filipino vessels from the pre-colonial period, like the Balangay, were outrigger canoes with incredible stability. The outrigger design, which Filipinos pioneered, prevents capsizing in rough seas. It's so effective that modern sailboats still use variations of this technology. These weren't crude rafts. They were sophisticated multi-hull vessels with sewn plank construction, adjustable sails, and cargo capacity that could rival Viking longships. The Balangay discovered in Butuan, dated to 320 CE, was 45 feet long and could carry 30 people plus cargo. It was built entirely without metal nails, using wooden pegs and plant fiber rope. This is 500 years before the Viking Age even started, and archaeological evidence suggests similar vessels existed thousands of years earlier. Now, Vikings will rightfully get credit for their innovation. The Longships' shallow draft meant they could raid up rivers and escape before armies could mobilize. That's brilliant tactical design. But here's the thing, Filipino vessels could do that too. The Balangay's shallow draft allowed it to navigate rivers and coastal shallows just as effectively. The difference is that Filipino shipbuilders had been refining this technology for millennia before Vikings even existed as a culture. Let's address the elephant in the room. Why don't we learn about this? Why are Vikings famous worldwide while ancient Filipino maritime culture is barely mentioned outside the Philippines? The answer is colonialism and who got to write the history books. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Philippines in 1521, they found a thriving maritime civilization with extensive trade networks spanning from Japan to Java. Filipino ships were sailing to China, Siam, and the Spice Islands. The Kingdom of Tondo, which controlled Manila Bay, was a major regional power with diplomatic relations across Southeast Asia. But colonial narratives needed the Philippines to be primitive to justify colonization. So that history got erased. Textbooks focused on European achievements, while ignoring equally impressive, often more ancient, accomplishments from other cultures. It's only in the last few decades that archaeologists and historians have started correcting the record. Here's another mind-blowing fact. Ancient Filipinos were using sophisticated astronomical navigation thousands of years before Europeans. They could read wave patterns, identify currents, and use stars to navigate across open ocean without instruments. Polynesian navigation gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so, but Filipino navigational knowledge was just as advanced. Some researchers argue it was even more sophisticated because Filipinos were navigating more complex inter-island routes with unpredictable currents. The Viking sunstone, a crystal that might have helped them navigate by polarized light, is celebrated as genius, and it was. But Filipinos were navigating thousands of miles using environmental cues that required generations of accumulated knowledge and teaching. That's not just technology. That's sophisticated scientific understanding passed down through oral tradition. Let's do a direct technology comparison. Viking longships had iron rivets and nails. Filipino vessels used wooden pegs and fiber lashing. At first, that sounds like Vikings had the advantage. But here's the twist. Sewn plank and lashed construction is actually more flexible and better suited for tropical waters. Wood expands and contracts with temperature and humidity. Nailed construction can become rigid and crack. Lashed construction flexes with the wood, making it more durable in tropical conditions. Viking longships were optimized for cold northern waters and river raiding. Filipino vessels were optimized for typhoons, coral reefs, and long-distance ocean trade. Different environments, different solutions, both brilliant. In terms of range, Vikings made it from Norway to North America, roughly 4,000 kilometers. Incredible, but Austronesian peoples, including Filipinos, spread from Southeast Asia to Madagascar and Easter Island, covering nearly half the globe. That's over 10,000 kilometers of open ocean navigation. The distances aren't even comparable, and here's something that will blow your mind. When Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521, his fleet was falling apart. They'd been at sea for months. Their ships were rotting, their crews were dying of scurvy, and they were barely holding together. Filipino vessels they encountered were in perfect condition, well provisioned, and their crews were healthy. The technological advantage everyone assumes Europeans had. It didn't exist. In fact, Magellan's translator and guide, Enrique of Malacca, was the first person to circumnavigate the globe, not Magellan. Enrique was Southeast Asian, possibly Filipino, and he'd already traveled west from Asia to Europe with Magellan's earlier expeditions. When they reached the Philippines, he was back in his home region. He'd gone all the way around the world. But history books credit Magellan's crew instead, even though Magellan died in the Philippines and Enrique arguably completed the journey first. Let's talk about boat-building speed. Vikings could construct a longship in a few months with a dedicated crew. Impressive, but Filipino shipbuilders could construct a balangay in similar timeframes using only stone tools and natural materials. No iron, no forges. Just wood, fiber, and thousands of years of refined technique. When you factor in the technology available, Filipino shipbuilding is arguably more impressive. Now, Viking longships were definitely better warships for their specific purpose. That shallow draft, those oar banks, the ability to beach and launch quickly, those features made them perfect for hit-and-run raids on coastal monasteries. Vikings weren't trying to build trading vessels or exploration ships. They built weapons platforms that could strike fast and disappear. Filipino vessels were multi-purpose. They were trading ships, fishing boats, war vessels, and exploration craft all in one. Different design philosophy. Vikings specialized, Filipinos generalized. Neither approach is better. They reflect different needs and different maritime cultures. But if we're talking about who mastered ocean navigation first, it's not even close. Filipinos were building ocean-going vessels 40,000 years ago. Vikings started around 800 CE. That's a 39,000-year head start. It's not a competition, it's archaeological fact. The real question is why this matters, because history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding human innovation and giving credit where it's due. For too long, Western-centric history has ignored or minimized achievements from other cultures. That's not just inaccurate. It's unfair to the billions of people whose ancestors accomplished incredible things. Filipino maritime technology represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. These weren't people with universities or libraries or metal tools. They were Stone Age cultures that figured out how to cross oceans, navigate by stars, and build vessels that could survive typhoons. That's not primitive, that's genius. And it's not just Filipinos. Indigenous maritime cultures across the Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia accomplished things that European cultures wouldn't match for thousands of years. The outrigger canoe, which Austronesians invented, is still considered one of the most stable small craft designs ever created. Modern racing sailboats use multi-hull designs inspired by Pacific Island technology. Vikings deserve their reputation. They were fierce warriors, skilled sailors, and they absolutely changed European history. But they weren't uniquely talented or specially gifted. They were one maritime culture among many. And when you compare them to cultures that had been perfecting ocean navigation for tens of thousands of years, they're actually quite late to the party. Here's the final piece that ties everything together. In 2025, researchers are testing ancient Filipino boat designs to understand exactly how these vessels worked. The FLOW project is reconstructing prehistoric watercraft using only materials and techniques available thousands of years ago. Early results show these vessels are incredibly seaworthy, efficient, and capable of long-distance voyages. Modern sailors testing these reconstructions are shocked at how well they perform. This isn't theory anymore. We're proving through experimental archaeology that ancient Filipinos had maritime technology that rivals anything developed in medieval Europe. And they developed it tens of thousands of years earlier. So who mastered the ocean first? Ancient Filipinos, and it's not even close. Who had the bigger historical impact on European history? Vikings, obviously. But impact and innovation are different things. Vikings get remembered because they raided Europe, and European scholars wrote the history books. Filipinos get forgotten because colonialism erased their achievements. But the archaeological record doesn't lie. Stone tools don't lie. 40,000-year-old cordage doesn't lie. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's only getting stronger as more research is published. The next time someone talks about Vikings as history's greatest sailors, you can tell them about the people who were catching sharks in the open ocean 35,000 years before Vikings even existed. Tell them about the civilization that spread across half the planet using Stone Age technology. Tell them about the maritime culture so advanced that when Europeans finally arrived, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. History is bigger than what we learned in school. And the more we dig, the more we discover that human innovation has always been global, diverse, and absolutely incredible. Ancient Filipinos weren't just part of that story. They were pioneers. They were masters of the ocean for 40,000 years before anyone else even tried. That's not alternative history. That's not revisionism. That's just history, told accurately for once.